good evening. Tonight we will be reading a masterpiece, a classic of American literature, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So great. We're starting on page 61. We are reading chapter 4. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young lady, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. "One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass." Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed, "This schedule in effect, July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. All right, so I'm going to read a long list of names. I'm going to read it pretty quickly. You don't need to remember any of these people. You just need to imagine all the famous and wealthy people that you know today. So you would think that this is the kind of party where you would see Jay-Z and Beyonce and Warren Buffett and Mark Zuckerberg and Ariana Grande and every single Kardashian. And of course, Kim had to bring Kanye, who's probably on a table spouting some nonsense about something. And Bill Gates and the Obamas and the Clintons and the Trumps, and they're all making polite dinner conversation. And Taylor Swift and Katy Perry and Cardi B and Nicki and Drake and Oprah and Michael Jordan and Justin Bieber and the Hiltons and Jeff Bezos and Michael Bloomberg and Elon Musk and the Waltons and Diddy, a.k.a. I'm really not an actor, and Dre and Migos and Lauryn Hill and Jennifer Lawrence and Angelina and Brad are both at the party, and they're trying really hard to ignore each other, or at least act polite. And that guy who played Piglet in the old Winnie the Pooh cartoons. So just imagine all those famous people are there, because none of these names are all that important. From East Egg, then, came the Chesterbeckers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, whom I knew at Yale, and Dr. Webster Civet, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Black Buck, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats at whosoever came near, and the Ismays and the Christies, or rather, Hubert Auerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair, they say, turned cotton white one winter afternoon for no good reason at all. Clarence Endive was from East Egg, as I remember. He came only once, in white knickerbockers, and had a fight with a bum named Eddie in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Cheadles and the O.R.P. Schraders and the Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia and the Fishguards and the Ripley Snells. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's automobile ran over his right hand. The Danceys came too, and S.B. Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Maurice A. Flink and the Hammerheads and Beluga, the tobacco importer, and Beluga's girls. From West Egg came the Poles and the Mulreadys, and Cecil Roebuck and Cecil Shinn, and Gulick, the state senator, and Newton Orchid, who controlled films par excellence, and Eckhouse and Clyde Cohen and Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, and all connected with the movies in one way or another, and the Catlips and the Bembergs and G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. Da Fontana, the promoter, came there, and Ed LaGrosse and James B. Rotgut Ferret and the DeLongs and Ernest Lilly. They came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out, and Associated Traction would have to fluctuate profitably next day. A man named Klipspringer was there so often and so long that he became known as the Boarder. Okay, so I lied. You don't need to remember anybody in this section except this guy, Klipspringer. He's going to come back later. He's just a freeloader, and he is basically living at Gatsby's house, because Gatsby has a hotel, and he lives there alone. Yeah, so he just lives there for free. Freeloads. I doubt if he had any other home. Of theatrical people, there were Gus Ways and Horace O'Donovan and Lester Meyer and George Duckweed and Francis Bull. Also from New York were the Cromes and the Backesons and the Denekers and Russell Betty and the Corrigans and the Kelleher's and the Dewars and the Scullys and S.W. Belcher and the Smirks and the young Quinns, divorced now, and Henry L. Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClanahan arrived always with 4 girls. Okay, you gotta picture Hugh Hefner. He always has different girls with him, but they always kind of fit the same type. They were never quite the same girls in physical person, but they were so identical one with another that it inevitably seemed that they had been there before. I've forgotten their names. Jacqueline, I think, or else Consuela, or Gloria, or Judy, or June. And their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and months, or the sterner ones of the great American capitalists, whose cousins, if pressed, they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all these, I can remember that Faustina O'Brien came there at least once, and the Baedecker girls, and young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Albrechtsberger and Miss Hogg, his fiancée, and Ardita Fitzpeters and Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, and Miss Claudia Hipp, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur, and a prince of something whom we called Duke, and whose name, if I ever knew it, I have forgotten. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its 3-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. "Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together." He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He's like me. I fidget all the time. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. "It's pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He jumped off to give me a better view. "Haven't you ever seen it before?" I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. Okay, picture this car. It's an important symbol. So on the outside, it's yellow. What valuable metal is yellow? And on the inside, it's green. So how is this car the perfect symbol of new money? You know, it's reminiscent of money. And it just shines in the sun. There are all these mirrors, and it just reflects all this light. It's like a little disco ball of a car. I had talked with him perhaps 6 times in the past month, and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression, that he was a person of some unidentified consequence, had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-colored suit. "Look here, old sport," he broke out surprisingly. "What's your opinion of me, anyhow?" A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. I mean, imagine you're spending time with a friend and all of a sudden out of nowhere they're like, "So what do you really think about me?" What? Who asked that? "Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life," he interrupted. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear." So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversation in his halls. "I'll tell you God's truth." His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. "I'm the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West. All dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It is a family tradition. So in just a second, it's going to matter. The Middle West is the Midwest, and that's where we are. Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, like all the states, Missouri, all the states like in our general area are called the Midwest. He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying.